back, brothers to Warhammer. Tonight we're covering an entire lore behind the Shadowkeepers, the most secret custodians. Before in the video, be sure to like, comment any videos, topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. Last but not least, be sure to check out the description below for the merch. Now, I want to thank you guys for your support. I've been killing it like usual. Now, let's get into the video.
Beneath the golden throne, the lie of the Golden Legion begins to flake away like gilt paint from rusted iron. Ask a pilgrim upon Terra what the Adeptus Custodes are, and he will speak of angels made manifest. He will picture giants in auramite, every plate a mirror for the light of cathedral spires, every weapon a relic whose name is a prayer. He will imagine them striding through marble halls and across balcony colonnades, banners hanging overhead, the air heavy with incense and hymns. In his mind, they are a living fresco, forever frozen in victorious poses, the perfect guardians of a perfect God. That is the story the Imperium tells itself, the story it must keep telling or risk collapse. It is not false, not entirely. There are custodians whose armor still burns with solar brilliance, whose every step is witnessed by 1,000 eyes and 1,000 recording lenses. There are shield hosts who march upon crusades, whose banners bear the sigils of the Solar Watch, the emissaries. Imperatus, the dread host, the Emperor's chosen. Their names are sung by the few who know them and whispered by those who only know of them. They are the visible edge of the 10,000, but they are only the edge. Deep below the Hall of Banners and the echoing vaults where mortal envoys tremble in the presence of golden demigods, there is another Terra. It is a world of stone and sealed doors, of corridors that have never felt the sun. There the air smells of oil, old dust, and the faint, acrid sting of wards that burn in colors no human eye can see. The walls are not marble, but adamantium and rockcrete, layered in sigils that crawl if you look at them too long. The light is thin and sickly. The shadows are thick and patient. Here, the custodes do not shine. Armor that would blind a mortal gaze has been darkened, its auramite burnished down to a deep umber almost black, edges trimmed in crimson, and the dull gleam of locked steel. Tabards hang like strips of dried blood. Filigree takes the form of chains and keys rather than heroic laurels. The helms that look out upon these lightless ways are not meant to inspire awe. They are meant to be missed, to be part of the darkness until it is too late. These are the Shadowkeepers. In a single breath, they can be named, a shield host of the Adeptus Custodes, the wardens of the dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace, charged with the keeping of the last terrors of old night. Their victory tallies are not measured in banners captured or worlds reclaimed. Their wars are counted in the things that did not happen, the catastrophes that never had a chance to begin, because a door stayed shut and a lock did not fail. To understand why they exist at all, you have to look back beyond the Gothic arches and the marble, beyond the High Lords and their squabbling over a dying throne. You have to go back to Old Night. The age of strife is a phrase left to scholars and madmen. Old Night is what the Imperium calls it when it wishes to hide how much it forgets and how much it fears. It was the long fall between the first nascent human stellar civilization and the cruel parody that crawled out of the wreckage. For uncounted centuries, the warp boiled, storms cutting the worlds of mankind off from one another. Civilizations died screaming in the dark, their astropaths drowned, their fleets stranded. On some worlds, humanity degenerated to techno-barbarism, clutching fragmentary relics and half-remembered sciences like clubs. On others, human genius wedded itself to madness and reached down into places no mind should reach. Warp-tainted engines were born in that era, machines driven by bound entities that clawed at the walls of reality. Self-replicating scrap code infested data looms, spreading like spiritual plague through the noosphere. Bioweapons were grown and unleashed, whose appetites did not end when their wars were over. There were human warlords whose psychic natures had bloated into monstrous things and artifacts that seemed to drink time and reason from anyone who came too close. There were alien engines of godlike power, only half understood even by those who had stolen them. When the master of mankind strode across Terra in the Unification Wars, he conquered more than tribes and fortress states. His armies and his custodians found vaults filled with nightmares that had survived the long dark. During the early years of the Great Crusade, when the legions took to the stars, they found more. For every techno-barbarian tyrant thrown down, there were vaults of weapons and constructs that should never have been built. For every compliant world added to the Emperor's domain, there were things uncovered that even he did not trust to annihilate. That was the first hidden decision. It would be comforting to believe that a being of such power simply unmade every abomination he found, that the Emperor's fire burned so hot no shadow could remain. The truth is colder. Some horrors were too deeply interwoven with the fabric of reality to tear free without rending the cloth. Others were resilient in ways that would have amused a god and horrified a man. Destroying certain machines risked triggering fail-safe detonations that would scour continents. Attempting to banish specific warp entities might have opened doorways wider than the original wound. So the master of mankind did something that would haunt his Imperium forever. While the palace rose upon Terra, layer upon layer of marble and gold and adamantium thrust towards the poisoned skies, other chambers were carved downwards, where the sanctums of high lords and bureaucrats stacked upon one another like mausoleums of parchment. Deeper still, a different architecture grew. This was not a throne room. It was a prison. The dark cells are the bones of that choice. Imagine a labyrinth scooped into the bedrock beneath the cradle of mankind. Chambers upon chambers, each sealed by portals thicker than tank. Armor, ringed in sigils that hurt to look at. Imagine sanctic wards and null fields interlaced with heretical mechanisms whose design is a blasphemy even to the Mechanicus, all dedicated to a single purpose: to keep what lies inside from ever touching the galaxy again. There are cells where the air is still and dead, where nothing moves and no sound comes from beyond the door. There are others where the metal softly hums, where frost or condensation crawls in patterns that suggest something pressing against the inner surface, thinking, waiting. The Shadowkeepers walk those corridors. They patrol past doors that were sealed before their gene sire ever opened his eyes. They stand guard over vaults taken from the depths of old night, from the Unification Wars, from crusades against Xenos empires whose names have been scrubbed from every record except the sigils etched into their cages. They have fought in campaigns whose existence is classified before the first blade is drawn, not to win glory, but to escort some howling, bound thing, or some inert and yet somehow hungry relic back to these same halls. Among the shield hosts, the Shadowkeepers occupy a place both elevated and shunned. The Solar Watch stand upon the walls of the palace, and beyond, wardens of the void and the approach, vectors of terror. The emissaries Imperatus go forth as the speaking blades of the throne, parleying with chapter masters and primarchs returned from legend. The dread host ride forth when terror itself must be wielded as a weapon, when the sight of golden giants descending from the sky is as much a tool as their spears. The Emperor's chosen are chosen indeed, embodying aspects of their gene sire's will, in a fashion that mortals wrap in 100 layers of myth. The Shadowkeepers, by contrast, are spoken of rarely even among their own kind. Their livery is recorded in the vaults of the Armorium. Their existence is acknowledged in the layered bureaucracy of the palace. But there are no parades for them. No shrine world that depicts black-armored custodians pacing between prison doors will ever earn a pilgrim's coin. They are the host the Imperium prefers not to remember, because to remember them is to admit that beneath all the faith and all the fire, There are things its God Emperor could not destroy. This is why they matter, and this is why they serve as more than an interesting footnote in the organization of the Adeptus Custodes. To talk about the Shadowkeepers is not to recite a roster entry or explain a battlefield role. It is to perform an autopsy upon the Imperium's basement, to lay bare the bones under the marble. It forces the question no priest wishes to ask. What did the Emperor fear enough to hide and to guard for eternity? And why did he not simply unmake it? The dark cells are not scenery. They are a character in their own right, a presence that presses in upon those who walk them. Even a custodian, whose mind has been honed and shielded, and tempered until lesser psychers break upon it like waves on stone, cannot help but feel the wrongness in those halls. The air is thick, charged with a dread that never fades. The soft scrape of boot upon metal echoes too loudly. Shapes seem to move at the corner of vision, shadows shifting against the grain of logic. The mind begins to imagine sounds just beyond hearing, heartbeats that are not your own, claws against the inside of a door that has not opened in millennia, whispers in languages that never evolved in this universe. In that place, vigilance is not a virtue. It is a necessity, a survival reflex stretched over centuries. Complacency is not merely a sin, it is potential apocalypse. To tell the story of the Shadowkeepers properly, you cannot simply fix your gaze on one moment. You have to follow a line of blood and sealed sigils from the first days of the Unification era, when the Emperor first began locking away the things he could not annihilate. Through the great crusade, when the cells filled with trophies from shattered empires. Through the betrayal of the Horus heresy, when the palace itself became a battlefield and the prison beneath it trembled. Through the scouring and the long stale millennia of so-called peace, when the Adeptus Custodes were chained to terror and the Shadowkeepers sank deeper into their role as silent jailers. Then comes the wound across the galaxy, the great rift tearing real space in two and howling through the soul of the species, shaking the dark cells in ways no bombardment ever could. Finally, we arrive in the era Indomitus, when the wardens of those cells are dragged out into a galaxy more fractured and haunted than the one their master first set out to tame. Along that span, certain questions gnaw. What exactly lies behind those doors? Are they filled with rogue artificial minds, with proto-demons fused to machine and metal, with unborn gods in chains of nullstone? What escaped when reality itself split and the wards faltered? Who commands the jailers who have inherited this impossible duty? And what does that command do to a being crafted for open war when his war is reduced to pacing the same route between doors that must never open? How many worlds have already died screaming because some fragment of old night slipped its cage and fled into the dark between the stars? Those are not comfortable questions for the faithful of the Imperium. They chip away at the carefully layered myths that have crusted over the Golden Throne. They suggest that the master of mankind did not so much erase the dangers of his age as shove them into a vault beneath his seat and set his finest killers to watch over them until the end of time. Yet to understand the Shadowkeepers at all, you must lean into that discomfort. There are stories that make the Imperium look mighty, if grim. Tales of valiant space marines holding a breach, of Imperial Guard regiments breaking an alien siege at the cost of their own extinction, of saints burning with borrowed light for a final, glorious moment. There are narratives that let a listener feel that, though the galaxy is cruel, there is a pattern to its suffering, a heroism that gives meaning to the slaughter. The Shadowkeepers offer no such comfort. They stand in corridors that have never seen the sky and listen for sounds that must never be heard. They are the blade the Imperium hopes never to draw, aimed not at some external enemy, but at the possibility that its own past might rise again and devour it. To look at them closely is to stare at the things the Emperor of mankind feared enough to bury beneath his own throne, and to admit that some of those buried fears are now loose in the broken night beyond Terra's polluted sky. That is where this telling begins, in the space between the myth of the Golden Guardians and the reality of the black-armored wardens below. Follow them into the dark, and the gilded image of the Imperium will not survive, unchanged. Terra was already a corpse when the Emperor began to carve his empire from it. The Age of Strife had seen to that. Once, long before Old Night, oceans had glittered with shipping lanes, and the skies had been bright with ordered traffic. In the wake of the warp storms, when astro-telepathic voices were drowned and human worlds went blind to one another, Terra rotted into something mean and broken. In that graveyard of nations, the unification wars began. The chronicles that survived speak of techno-barbarian fortress states rising from the bones of drowned continents and blasted plains. Each was a petty empire of ash, ruled by men who called themselves kings, tyrants, warlords, or gods. Their banners were stitched from flayed standards, and their crowns were devices that hissed with half-understood power. Some wore armor grafted directly into their flesh, composite plate and whirring servos bolted to skin by drunken gene surgeons. Others surrounded themselves with beastmen and vat-grown brutes, or with ragged chimeras, whose limbs whirred with crude augmetics and whose eyes burned with warp-lit madness. In their thrones and strongholds, they clutched relics of a better age, machines and weapons whose spirits they did not comprehend, only appeased. Across this ruin strode the master of mankind and his armies. His thunder warriors were blunt instruments of conquest, burning out city hives and shattering fortress mountains with the brute force of their advance. The Legio Custodes were a different blade entirely, precise and terrible, their golden armor reflecting in the fires they themselves had set. Where they passed, blood and rebellion ended. Where they set their heels, new banners rose, bearing the aquila of a future Imperium. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the crash of breaking citadels, there was another layer to that conquest, one that the songs of victory leave out. Every techno-barbarian king who ruled over a patch of poisoned wasteland had his horde. There were vaults of pre-strife data cores, cradling fragmentary knowledge and scrap code ghosts. There were weapon pits, where guns lay stacked in their thousands, still slick with lubricants, older than the warlords who hoarded them. There were shrines where desperate populations knelt before machines they no longer understood, feeding them blood or prayer, or both, in the hope that they would continue to function. As the Emperor's forces broke these strongholds, they found more than mortal foes to cut down. They discovered engines that sang in the language of the warp, war machines whose machine spirits did not merely awaken when called upon, but watched their users with hungry, alien regard. They uncovered armor that slowly rewrote the flesh inside it, reconfiguring its wearer to match some long-forgotten optimization profile. There were relics that warped probability around themselves, battlefields where luck had curdled into something weaponized and spiteful. There were entire data vaults whose contents were infested with self-propagating scrap code, the digital equivalent of a warp plague, ready to leak into any linked network and devour it from within. Those were only the human horrors. From the wreckage of Xenos craft and the shattered depths of alien temples came other things, worse in their way, because they had never been meant for human hands at all. There were shards of devices that radiated a hunger that was not physical, that made unshielded men dream of drowning in oceans of glass light. There were crystalline lattices that sang subsonic notes, audible only to psychers, notes that eroded sanity like acid on bone. There were dormant war engines of non-human manufacture that seemed to react to thought itself, humming in anticipation when a psyker approached, like hounds scenting blood. Some of these relics had fallen to terror in the long twilight of old night. Others had been pulled from orbiting graveyard hulks, corpses of ships whose crews had died screaming centuries before the first Thunder Warrior took his first ragged breath. A more straightforward conqueror might have given a simple order: destroy it all. Fire would have been the easy answer. Exterminating flame over the vaults, orbital bombardment on any site that reeked of warp taint or alien artifice, the Emperor's will expressed as pure annihilation. It is tempting to imagine that he did just that, that in his righteous anger he burned every abomination away and left nothing behind but ash. Reality was not so clean. Some of the things uncovered during the Unification Wars and the earliest years of the Great Crusade were not vulnerable in any way a human mind would recognize. Attempts at physical destruction triggered dormant contingencies. A relic annihilated would respond with an implosive detonation that sucked men screaming into a point of impossible density, or with an expanding cloud of invisible radiation that turned the bones of an entire city's population into luminescent dust over the course of a few sickening days. Some constructs were bound to warp entities that reacted violently to attempts at severance, lashing out through the psychic plane in storms of possession and madness. Even when a particular engine or artifact seemed to shatter under bombardment, its corrupted influence would linger like an echo, infesting the local noosphere, insinuating itself into logic engines and voxnets, blooming later as scrap code or machine spirit delirium. Other relics were competitive with the Emperor's own strength. There were things that he could unmake only at cost, dangers that would have required his personal intervention in a dozen places at once. The galaxy was already beginning to open before him. There were primarchs to be found, legions to be led, and an entire human species to be dragged back to unity. He could not afford to stand over every bubbling warp fissure and every infected data arch until they were gone, beyond recovery. So, in the cold calculus that only a being of his genius could make, another doctrine emerged. If they could not safely destroy these nightmares, they would contain them. If they could not unmake Old Night, they would bury its most poisonous remnants where no one could reach them. The Imperial Palace rose upon Terra as a symbol of dominion and unity, a monument to the promise of a secular, rational future, what the Emperor named the Imperial Truth. Its towers speared the polluted skies. Its walls replaced the fortresses of 100 conquered tyrants. Beneath it, out of sight of the processions and banners, other structures were cut into the bones of the world. Vaults were carved into the bedrock, their walls lined with metals unknown to any but the Emperor's personal artisans and the savants of the Mechanicum's inner circles. Chambers were hollowed out and sheathed in adamantium and plasteel, then sigil-bound in inks that glowed with a light no lumen produced. The thickest of these gates were laid in place by custodian hands, slabs of reinforced metal so massive that even Astartes' engines would have labored to move them. Before they were sealed, the Emperor and his most trusted psychers wove sanctic wards into the seams, layered banishments and metaphysical locks nested one inside another like teeth in a predator's jaw. This was the beginning of the dark cells. The decision to create them did not end with architecture. A prison needs wardens. The Legio Custodes had been made as the Emperor's personal guardians, each one handcrafted, gene-wrought perfection, souls and bodies honed to serve as both sword and shield. Their natural place was at his side, their duty to stand where the fight was fiercest and cut it down. Yet certain of them were chosen for a different task. These first wardens were selected not for flamboyant prowess in the open field, but for the qualities required to stand for decades in the presence of things that should not exist. Iron discipline, unbreakable will, the ability to see horror and remain unmoved, to hear whispers crawling under the skin of reality and not reach for forbidden answers. Where their brothers marched in ranks beneath the light of day, This chosen detachment descended into the half-finished vaults beneath the palace and did not return. Their orders were stark in their simplicity. Guard what we place here. Let nothing escape. If containment fails, die closing the breach. They were present when the first cages were filled. Thunder warriors dragged bound techno-relics into the deepest cells, sweating under the weight of devices older than their entire gene line. Psychers in warded chains were marched to the threshold of nullstone chambers and hurled inside, their talents smothered at once by fields that killed song and thought alike. There were days when the corridors below the palace shook with howling, or with bass notes that were not sound but pressure, battering against the inside of the skull. The wardens did not flinch. They stood between those doors and the rest of the planet, and waited for the noise to stop. Over time, those rough beginnings hardened into a structure that would outlast empires. The Emperor's chosen artisans refined the design of the cells. Some became spheres within spheres, each layer spinning at a different speed and direction, their movement part of the lock that kept the thing inside from aligning with the world beyond. Others were pits lined with null wards, their prisoners suspended in fields that pressed in from every angle like the hands of an unseen jailer. There were corridors where glyphs crawled constantly, shifting to counteract the slow grinding of reality and unreality against one another. Only a handful of custodians and a few favored tech adepts ever understood the full pattern of those wards, and none of the latter were permitted to leave once they had learned. What lay behind the doors was never set down in a single ledger. To attempt such a catalogue would have been madness, a text whose very reading would have been a heresy. Instead, there were partial records, sealed addenda, memory palaces built inside the minds of certain custodians. Between these fragments, a shape emerges. There were war engines from old Night, whose machine spirits had tasted the warp and liked it. Constructs that had once walked battlefields under human command, but now hungered for command in turn. Some of these machines slumbered in their chains, their systems cycling endlessly through battle protocols they would never again enact. Others were active in ways deeper than power conduits or energy cells. Their presence was a pressure in the air, a sense of attention that brushed against the wardens like the weight of a gaze. There were rogue war spirits, excised from their housings and given no new bodies, swirling in loops of code inside coffin-sized logic engines. There were captured alien divinities, or things close enough to that accursed title to make the distinction academic, their essence trapped in crystalline matrices or bound inside carved stones that hummed with hatred. There were warp entities that had refused banishment when confronted on demon worlds, beings that the Emperor could not easily unmake even with his strength, now chained in places where the walls between real space and the immaterium were weighted with nullstone and layered hexagrammatic wards. Some cells held weapons rather than entities. There were guns that rewrote causality around their targets, blades that sliced through probability as easily as through flesh, artifacts that poisoned the concept of loyalty in anyone who stood too close to them for too long. There were vaults full of data, entire cogitator stacks sealed away because the scrap code inside them was not a disease that could be cured, but a predator that would only grow hungrier the more it fed. The custodians set to watch. Over this subterranean menagerie swore oaths that were unlike those of their kin above. They did not promise to stand at the Emperor's side in every battle, for their place was instead at his feet, far below his throne. They did not swear to carry banners into the storms of war, because the only banners in the dark cells were warning sigils and the coded symbols of containment. Their vows were not of glory, but of absence. They pledged to be unseen, uncelebrated, to accept that their names would never appear in the panegyrics of conquest. Their duty would pass from one silent generation to the next, an unbroken chain of watchfulness stretching down the centuries. All of this unfolded while the Emperor preached his imperial truth to the species he was remaking. He spoke of a rational future, of an age in which superstition and gods would be discarded as relics of an ignorant past. The warp would be a phenomenon to be measured and exploited, not placated. The galaxy would be colonized and ordered, its horrors driven back by human will and human science. Yet beneath the very podiums from which that truth was proclaimed, beneath the palace that symbolized it, a mythic underworld was being hollowed out and filled with monsters. The contrast is stark enough to be called hypocrisy, though in the mind of a being for whom mortals were pieces on a galactic game board, it was perhaps only pragmatism. Whatever the justification, the paradox remains. The future that was promised rested physically upon a foundation of fear, upon vaults whose sole purpose was to keep the worst mistakes and enemies of that same future from ever seeing light. What may have started as a battlefield expedient hardened, inevitably, into doctrine. In the early dawning of the Great Crusade, there might still have been the illusion that the dark cells were temporary. Lock it away, deal with it later, seal it beneath terror for a century, perhaps two, until the Imperium is stable enough to risk a more complete solution. Later never came. With each new compliance, each Xenos empire broken, and each human world reclaimed, more forbidden relics were added to the list of things too risky to destroy and too dangerous to leave. The Mechanicum, bound to the Emperor's cause, yet fanatical about the preservation of knowledge, lobbied for the study of certain finds. Some were granted to them, under sanction and in carefully monitored forge vaults. Others were rejected out of hand and sent instead to the cells below the palace, because even Martian caution was not enough. There were Psyker enclaves broken open that yielded adepts whose minds had been shaped into weapons as much as their powers. The least corrupt were bound into service. The worst were hurled into warded pits and left to languish until their bones and their thoughts both went still. Nothing in the dark cells was scheduled for release. No plan existed for a future in which they would be empty, the best that could be. Hoped for was that the locks would hold until the end of all things, or at least long enough that the problem would become someone else's. As the Great Crusade pushed outwards and the legions left golden footprints on worlds no terran had seen in long millennia, the flow of forbidden things became a steady river. The wardens below the palace found their numbers quietly reinforced. Whole cohorts were seconded from the Legio Custodes to serve periods of service beneath the throne, returning to the wider brotherhood with eyes that did not quite lose the haunted watchfulness of the dark. Others went down and never came up, their duty extending until death, or until even their transhuman frames finally failed and were laid in tombs that were themselves warded lest something have followed them home. By the time the Imperium's banners flew over a significant fraction of the galaxy, the proto-Shadowkeepers had already coalesced into something recognizably distinct. They had not yet taken the name that would be whispered in later ages, but the function was the same. They were no longer simply a detachment of convenient jailers. They were becoming a host whose entire identity, doctrine, and existence revolved around one simple, terrible fact. There were things locked beneath the palace that could never be allowed to walk under any sky again. There came a point when the nameless detachment in the depths ceased to be a temporary expedient and became something else. The Legio Custodes does not create new traditions lightly. Every title, every honor, every deviation from the perfect form of its duty must justify itself before the standard of the Emperor's will. When the dark cells had swollen with enough sealed doors and buried nightmares that even he could no longer pretend they were a short-term measure, the change was made. They were recognized as a shield host in their own right, a body of more than 100 custodians, formerly sworn to that forgotten war, beneath the palace. Their appellation was simple, brutally accurate, and entirely appropriate to the age of ghosts they walked through, the Shadowkeepers. Where the armor of their brother hosts shone like captured starlight, theirs was sable. Auramite was smothered under layers of dark lacquer, dulled to a low, ominous gleam. The gold remained in the bones of the plate, in the way it moved and the way it endured. But to mortal eyes they were giants cast from shadow, outlines picked out only in the red of deep-dried blood. Their robes and tabards were crimson, not bright like fresh arterial spray, but the color of seals on forbidden edicts, of wax stamped over things never meant to be opened again. Sigils of keys and locks adorned their shoulders. Chains were engraved into their greaves and gauntlets. That livery was not chosen to impress a parade ground crowd. It was chosen to vanish into the gloom of the cells, to be part of the darkness, until the moment they decided not to be. Not every custodian could serve there, and not every custodian would. The Shadowkeepers' ranks were swollen with wardens, those of the 10,000, whose oaths of protection and focus were already fanatical, even by their own impossible standards. A custodian warden is, by nature, a creature of static duty. Where other brothers might ride jet bikes into the teeth of a Xenos charge, or fall from the sky in ablative fire, wardens are the ones who stand and do not move, who interpose their shields between the thing they guard and the universe arrayed against it. For the Shadowkeepers, that instinct is honed into something colder. They are not chosen for flamboyant heroism or for the kind of glory that populates the few sanctioned legends of the 10,000. They are selected after tests of will that would break space marines and erase mortal minds. Their thoughts are probed for any hint of morbid curiosity, any desire to know the unknowable that might lead them to crack a seal, just a little, to see what happens. Their dreams are examined by silent psychometric engines. Those whose resolve is unyielding, whose sense of duty is not merely strong but absolute, are given a choice that is not really a choice at all. They can go down into the dark cells and never fully come back, or they can continue their service elsewhere and remember forever that they declined. The atmosphere that greets those who accept is unlike anything in the light-haunted spaces of the palace above. The corridors themselves feel wrong. Even when the stone and metal are newly cut, the sense of age and pressure is omnipresent, as if the world remembers what has been buried in its bones. The lumen strips are steady and functional, but they never quite drive the shadows away. They cling in corners and stack in layers, fluid in the way they retreat and advance with each step. The air has a thickness to it, not just from the ozone tang of wards and the chemical whisper of null fields, but from something that presses against the lungs and the nerves with equal insistence. A mortal man brought down here would go mad within hours, less from what he saw and more from what he felt. A custodian is not a mortal man. His mind has been shaped and shielded, tempered against the raw shriek of the warp and the million petty insanities of the Imperium. Even so, the dread is constant. It is never loud, never a scream in the ear or a vision forced between blinks. It is a steady, grinding weight. Every door the Shadowkeepers pass radiates a different flavor of threat. Cold, static hate from one, a seething, unfocused hunger from another, an unsettling vacuum from a third, as though the cell beyond holds not a thing, but an absence hungry to spread. Their transhuman hearts do not race, their hands do not shake, but every step is taken with the absolute certainty that if something were to go wrong, it would go wrong faster than even they could move. Against that backdrop, vigilance ceases to be a mere virtue and becomes ritual. The daily pattern of a Shadowkeeper is as rigid as the wards they walk past. Circuit patrols are not simple marches from one checkpoint to another. Each route is calculated to pass every key portal at set intervals, overlapping with the paths of other patrols, so that no door is ever unwatched. At each seal, the custodian stops. He inspects the lock, not with eyes alone, but with auspex sweeps keyed to the particular signatures of the wards built into its frame. He recites an oath of keeping, the words encoded with low-level triggers that interact with the psychic lattice woven through the metal. Should the pattern of that recitation ever fail to elicit the correct sympathetic resonance, alarms no mortal ear could perceive would howl through the bones of the complex. There are meditations designed explicitly for life down there, sanity testing exercises, internal labyrinths constructed in thought, walked through and checked for erosion. Custodians sit cross-legged in the light of ward candles that burn without flame, their eyes closed, cycling through memory palaces in which every detail has been fixed for centuries. A cracked fresco, a misremembered sigil, a face in the crowd that has no right to be there, all are signs that the mind is being worn down by proximity to the cells. Those who falter are rotated out, if they can be, or assigned to posts where their diminished resilience will not risk the fate of trillions. Some are laid to rest below, for their thoughts have become so saturated with the flavor of the dark cells that to bring them back to any other duty would be an unacceptable contamination. The rituals scale up across longer spans of time. Every few decades, major warding patterns are tested in coordinated ceremonies involving dozens of Shadowkeepers, their voices braided together in complex liturgical sequences that reassert the Emperor's will against the subtle drift of the immaterium. Every few centuries, entire sections of the prison are effectively rebooted, their seals cycled through controlled opening and resealing under the supervision of the lock warden and select tech adepts to prevent the system from accumulating unnoticed flaws. Millennial observances are held not as celebrations, but as grim accounting, tallying how many cells have been added, how many wardens have died, and how many incidents have been quietly resolved that the rest of the galaxy will never know about. Their iconography reflects all of this. Keys are everywhere in their heraldry. Stylized and ritualized, they appear as torque-locked silhouettes on pauldrons, as tiny charms hanging from weapon hilts, as embossed patterns on shield faces. Each key motif is slightly different, a personal emblem signifying not just the Shadowkeeper's role, but the specific vault or section he has sworn himself to. Chains are carved along greaves and gauntlets, not as decorative curlicues, but as hard, angular links, each one etched in such a way that, when viewed from the right angle, the pattern merges seamlessly into hexagrammatic wards. Some weapons are relics whose only purpose is failure. There are spears and axes whose machine spirits are calibrated for use in corridor fights, where any missed blow will punch through 3 layers of wall and wake something better left dreaming. There are demolition charges keyed to break open bulkheads in such a way that the resulting collapse will funnel any escaping entity into a killing lane. There are compact artifacts of unknown provenance, worn at belts or on chest mounts, whose activation will annihilate a defined bubble of space so completely that nothing within it, material or immaterial, will ever come back. The cost of using them is usually the lives of the Shadowkeepers themselves. That is accepted, even planned for. Their primary function is found in the quiet promise they represent. If containment fails, there is a final door they can close, and it closes on all of them. Their doctrine reflects that priority. The Shadowkeepers do not train as line infantry. Their stratagems, as recorded in the hidden vaults of the Strategium, revolve around isolating and neutralizing single, overwhelmingly dangerous targets. They are drilled to drag a towering war engine down in a flurry of precision blows, to focus the full weight of their assault on the nexus of a warp incursion rather than the countless lesser daemons boiling out of it. In engagements where they deploy beyond the palace, they are the ones sent to punch through the thickest armor, to reach the heart of a heretical engine or a corrupted shrine and tear it out, no matter what stands between. It is not that they lack the capability to fight in broader theatres. Every custodian is a war in himself, and a squad of them is a catastrophe for any foe. But the Shadowkeepers walk into battle, expecting to face things that should not be stood against by any sane force at all. Their tactics reflect the knowledge that they are there to end the threat, even if only one of them walks away. Especially if only one of them walks away. Among the other shield hosts, this specialization breeds a complicated mix of emotions. Custodians are not prone to pettiness. They are not subject to the same rivalries and jealousies that corrode lesser warriors. Yet they are still individuals, with preferences and perspectives shaped by their duties. The Solar Watch, guardians of the void and the high approach routes, look upon the Shadowkeepers with a kind of grim respect and quiet relief. It is one thing to watch the horizon for incoming threats, another to pace a corridor knowing that the enemy is already locked a few meters away, forever pressing at its cage. The dread host, who wield terror as a weapon on open fields, understand the value of fear, but do not envy those who live steeped in it. The emissaries Imperatus, who walk among Primarchs reborn and negotiate at the level of Imperial realpolitik, recognize the Shadowkeepers as an aspect of the throne's authority that cannot be mentioned in any treaty. Most custodians will never set foot in the dark cells. They will know of their existence in the way they know of a distant fortress whose guns will never turn inward. They will see the sable armor and red robes of a Shadowkeeper at formal convocations and know instinctively that their brother's gaze has measured different threats than theirs. If offered a choice between a campaign against a Black Crusade and a decade patrolling those oubliettes, many of them would choose the battlefield without hesitation. Dying in the light against an enemy you can see is a cleaner proposition than living in the company of what the Shadowkeepers guard. For the wider Imperium, the shield host might as well be a rumor. The High Lords do not command them, they petition. The Inquisition does not summon them, it requests, and even then only channels so arcane that few Inquisitors ever discover them. When someone from outside is brought down into the dark cells, it is never casual. Perhaps they themselves are a threat, a psyker whose power and instability mark him as a candidate for the deepest pits. Perhaps they are being shown a fraction of the prison as leverage, as a terrible education, as a warning of what awaits if they fail in some critical task. The journey below is usually the end of that previous life. An Inquisitor who descends and sees even a single row of sealed doors will never again be able to act as though the worst dangers facing mankind are the heretics and aliens he can name. A High Lord who hears a muffled impact from behind a gate thicker than his own palace walls will understand, if he is capable of understanding at all, how small his decisions are compared to the weapons and entities buried under his seat. Some of them do not come back up. Those who do are often subtly different, a little more brittle, a little more ruthless, their paranoia freshly sharpened on the knowledge that there are nightmares on Terra that would make a demon world look almost honest. Faith in such company becomes something else. The Shadowkeepers know what lurks in the warp, not in the abstract way of a hive priest warning children about demons, but in the precise clinical manner of men who walk past cages that hum with barely contained unreality. They know what happens to most human souls when they die, not because it has been revealed to them in comforting visions, but because they have seen the after effects of possessions, of soul-shearing weapons, of rituals that leave nothing behind but a psychic echo of torment. They know that the Emperor on the Golden Throne is not a kindly god waiting to embrace his faithful, but a crippled, burning engine, holding back tides that would drown the species in one night if it faltered. They maintain the facade of Imperial faith because someone has to. They stand in formation when ecclesiarchy choirs come to chant litanies in the upper halls, and they do not correct the priest's theology. For the masses to keep working, bleeding, and dying in the Emperor's name, they must believe he will do something more with their souls than feed a beacon and fuel a cage. The Shadowkeepers do not have that luxury. Their worldview is a practical nihilism hardened into duty. The universe is hostile. The afterlife is worse. There is no succor, no mercy, only the grim satisfaction of having done one's part to hold the line for one more hour. Each of them was created to be a demigod of war. Gene-wrought and soul-forged, they were meant to stride across battlefields where entire armies break around their ankles. Their spears were designed to skewer champions and monsters, their shields to turn aside volleys that would flatten fortresses. In another age, in another telling of the same epoch, they might have been heroes in the simplistic sense, their deeds painted on cathedral ceilings for the awe of the faithful. Instead, the Shadowkeepers spend centuries walking the same buried corridors, their footfalls the only sound in a world of locks and seals. They listen to doors and hope they never have an excuse to draw their weapons. Their greatest success is measured in nothing happening at all, in another day passing without an alarm. They are living contradictions, golden reapers dulled and blackened, scythes kept in reserve not to harvest glory, but to prune back the poisonous growths of an age mankind pretends to have escaped. In the end, their war is not fought in the sight of suns, but in the silence between heartbeats, where reality presses thin against the things that want to claw through and devour it. Among the 10,000, there is a title that tastes of iron and dust when spoken, a word that carries the weight of locks and the memory of 100 buried wars. Shield Captain is an honor, emissary is a duty, dread is a weapon, but Lock Warden is something else, something heavier. It is the office given to the custodian, granted mastery over the Shadowkeepers, the one who stands at the apex of the wardens beneath the palace, and every warrior of the Auric host knows to lower his voice when that name is mentioned. The rank follows its bearer even into death. Long after flesh and plate have been laid in a tomb, the title endures in record and recollection, a mark of grave respect that no other office quite matches. To be Lockwarden is to sit astride a particular axis of the Emperor's will. Other shield captains lead cohorts into the light, driving spearheads into the hearts of rebellions and Xeno's empires. They stand on void ship command decks, or in palace strategia, moving pins and counters across stellar cartographic displays. The Lockwarden does these things when he must, but they are not his defining acts. His command is not a regiment or a fleet. His command is a map of doors deep beneath. Terror, each one a sealed scar on reality. His badge of office is not a plume or a cloak, but a ring of keys and cipher rods, some physical, some encoded into his own gene-wrought mind, each one corresponding to a prison that should never open. His duties go far beyond the usual remit of a battlefield commander. Every cell in the dark cells, from the deepest nullstone pit to the highest, most recently cut vault, is his personal responsibility. Every rune-locked portal and every warded archway lies beneath his chain of custody. He signs off on the maintenance of sigil arrays that only a handful of tech adepts are permitted to see. He knows which relic hums a little louder when the tides of the warp rise, which cage sweats frost even in the heat of Terra's core, which silent coffin of Archaeotech has begun to vibrate in sympathy with some distant nameless signal. If there is a forgotten artifact, still whispering to itself in a sealed chamber, its whispers are his problem. The Lockwarden carries within his thoughts a living inventory of monstrosities and mistakes. No complete written catalogue of the dark cells exists. Such a document would be a heresy all its own, a single point of catastrophic failure waiting to happen. Instead, the knowledge is fractured. Some of it is held in sealed Mechanicus data crypts, some in the minds of a few sanctioned savants, some in the collective recollections of the Shadowkeepers as they pass stories of their charges from one watch to the next. The only place where all those strands converge is in the Lockwarden's skull. He can walk the corridors in his imagination with perfect clarity, tracing routes past doors that have not been opened since the Unification Wars, recalling which wardings overlap and which must never interact, which cells are empty and which should never be. Every decision he makes is rendered in that context. For most commanders, error is measured in casualties and territory, a misjudged flanking, maneuver, a failed charge, a miscalculated bombardment. These are the tragedies that haunt ordinary generals. For the Lockwarden, miscalculation is something else entirely. To choose to move a relic from one cell to another is to risk disturbing a balance of energies that has settled over centuries. To alter a warding pattern in the hope of strengthening it is to tamper with structures designed, in part, by the Emperor himself and by psychers whose names the Imperium does not even remember. To unseal a cell for any reason, however urgent, is to invite the possibility that what comes out will not go back in. There is no such thing as a minor error in his role. Every choice he makes is taken at the edge of theoretical apocalypse, and he makes them anyway because someone must. His remit does not end at the threshold of the vaults. The doctrine of the Shadowkeepers states that should any creature or relic escape the dark cells, or should a newly emerged threat need to be incarcerated, there the Lockwarden must personally oversee the operation. He is the one who leads reclamation strikes when a cage is found empty, the one who steps onto broken soil light years from terror to point at a corrupted engine or a possessed demagogue and say, in effect, "This belongs below my palace." His presence on a battlefield is an omen far darker than any banner. It means that somewhere, somewhen, a door that should have stayed shut has opened or is about to. The current bearer of that title is Shield Captain Borser Thursk, a name that sits in the same breath as the darkest vaults he guards. The records describe him as grim, which is almost a joke where a custodian is concerned. Grimness is their default state. What sets Thursk apart is the intensity of it, a focus so sharp it feels like a pressure in the air around him. Utterly fearless, say the annals, though fear is perhaps too small a word for the reactions the dark cells evoke. It is more accurate to say that whatever shuddering of the soul those corridors induce, Thursk has learned to turn it into fuel for vigilance rather than a blade aimed inward. His steely watchfulness has made him ideal for a role that demands he live, in effect, inside a catalogue of all the things that might end mankind if they ever step beyond their cages. Before the galaxy tore itself open, his life was as bounded as the cells he kept. For something like a century and a half in terran measure, Borser Thursk rarely left the palace at all. There are only 2 recorded instances of him stepping off Terra before the birth of the Great Rift. On each occasion, his departure was tied to events of sufficient gravity that the Lockwarden's personal attention was required, and in each case he returned as soon as the matter was resolved, descending once more into the corridors that had become his entire world. His existence was defined by repetition, the same routes walked, the same seals checked, the same silent communion with doors that never opened. The wider Imperium's wars were hearsay to him, scraps of data and rumor brought down by scribes and emissaries. His war was conducted in silence and in the constant, unending present. Then the sky broke. When the great rift yawned wide and the cicatrix maledictum tore across reality, even Terra felt the wound. The Astronomicon howled, the warp storms clawed at the cradle of mankind. The palace shook in ways that had nothing to do with tectonics. Deep below, in the dark cells, wards flickered. Sigils that had burned steadily for 10,000 years sputtered and flared. For long moments, the distinction between inside and outside blurred, the walls between the prisoners and the rest of creation thinning under the pressure of raw, unfiltered empiric storm. When the echo of that cosmic spasm finally ebbed, the Shadowkeepers went about their work, inspecting seals, tracing wards, checking every door. They found some of their jailers dead in positions of perfect attention. Their hearts stopped, and their minds burned out by proximity to whatever had tried to push through. Worse, they found cells standing empty. The locks were still in place. The wards were still active, but what they had been holding was gone. For Borser Thursk, that moment marked an ending and a beginning. The prison he had spent his life mastering had been violated by forces even he could not have anticipated. The nightmare that the Emperor had buried under his throne ages ago was now leaking into the wider galaxy. Relics that had slumbered in chains since the age of strife were suddenly at large, somewhere in a universe already half mad. The Lockwarden is recorded as having made a vow then, a private oath voiced in the presence of his fellow wardens and the sealed doors that remained. He would not set foot on Terra again until every escaped artifact and entity had been recaptured or destroyed. The palace that had once defined his enclosure became, by his own choosing, a place of exile. That promise flipped his role on its head. The prison master became a roaming executioner, a hunter whose quarry was not merely heretics or Xenos, but the Emperor's own discarded nightmares. Shadowkeeper detachments that had once rarely seen the open air began appearing across the war-torn Imperium, their sable armor and crimson robes descending through fire-wreathed skies. Thursk led them into warp-stormed war zones, where communications failed, and sane navigation was an act of faith as much as calculation. They fought through demon-haunted void hulks to reach vaults grown like cancers in the holds, prizing free relics that pulsed in time with the distant screams of the immaterium. They appeared on besieged worlds, slaughtered their way through whatever forces stood between them and a particular cult shrine or corrupted machine, and left just as abruptly, taking with them something bound in auric shackles or sealed within nullstone coffers. Whole campaigns have no better explanation in the records than that a custodian force arrived, burned the infection out, and departed without parley. In doing so, Borser Thursk found himself navigating the treacherous currents of Imperial politics in a way few Lockwardens before him had ever needed to. High Lords demanded explanations for custodian interventions in their sectors. Space Marine chapters bristled at golden warriors appearing unannounced in the midst of their crusades, seizing artifacts they had bled to capture. Inquisitors, accustomed to being the most dangerous men in any room, discovered that there were places even they were not invited and questions they were not permitted to ask. Thursk's authority came not from decree or edict, but from the simple, undeniable fact of what he represented. When a Shadowkeeper says that something must be taken, that a relic will be removed to Terra, there is no court of appeal. He explains as little as possible, because to explain too much would be to spread knowledge the Imperium cannot afford to have. Those left behind see only the surface, a golden host that arrives, wages a short, brutal war with an objective they never reveal, and vanishes like a bad dream. Among his own kind, the title he bears remains an object of solemn awe. Other shield captains know the burden that comes with it. They command fleets, strike forces, and palace cohorts. They answer the call when primarchs or regents demand the presence of the 10,000. The Lockwarden commands the line between the Imperium and the worst fragments of its own history. To hold that position is considered both an honor and a sentence. It offers authority that rivals any other office available to a custodian, and yet it nails the bearer's existence to the most joyless and hazardous duty their order possesses. There is a quiet understanding among the Auric giants that few aspire to that role, and fewer still are truly suited to it. They do not envy Borser Thursk, but they are glad he exists. The cost of that existence is counted not in visible scars, but in what is carried inside. If the Emperor is the captive god of the Imperium, a being nailed to his throne and bled for the maintenance of a failing light, then the Lockwarden is his high priest of containment. Thursk must remember every horror the species has locked away. He must know their shapes, their histories, the particular flavors of catastrophe they represent. He must track, in the theater of his mind, not just the state of the vaults beneath terror, but the movements of anything that has ever slipped those bonds. His thoughts are a ledger of ghosts and abominations, a burden he cannot share, because to do so would be to dilute the clarity that his duty demands. In a galaxy where most men pray to the Emperor for salvation from threats, they can at least name invasion, mutation, heresy. The Lockwarden prays, if he prays at all, that the locks hold for one more day. He walks battlefields and corridors alike, knowing that if he fails, the very concept of an Imperium may become moot in an instant, swallowed in something older and hungrier than any tyrant or Xenos host. The rest of mankind is spared that knowledge. That is the point. They are allowed to fear the enemies in front of them, to fight and die for banners and ideas, because somewhere between them and the deepest shadows stands one custodian with a ring of keys and a memory full of nightmares, making sure the worst of it never gets out. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, when the legions strode like storm fronts across the stars and the Emperor's banners flew over more human worlds than any scribe could count, the darkest part of his dominion was already beneath his feet. The dark cells had swelled. What had begun in the unification as a necessary hedge against old night's indestructible nightmares had become a labyrinth of prisons that burrowed deep beneath the Imperial palace. Relics and entities from hundreds of compliant worlds lay entombed there. Sealed vaults held war engines dragged from alien reliquaries, warp-tainted artifacts liberated from sorcerer kings, entire cogitator stacks saturated with malignant code. The wardens who walked those halls were an established arm of the Legio Custodes by then, even if most of their brother warriors preferred not to dwell on that fact. They were already living the life that would later define the Shadowkeepers, eternal watch in silence, far from the glory of the crusade. It was in that era that Prospero burned. When the edict went out against the Thousand Suns, the censure host assembled under the eye of the Captain General himself. The great work of the Emperor seemed to shudder on its foundations. To censure a Primarch was no small matter. Warships gathered in orbit over the doomed world. Space wolves in grey and white made ready to fall upon Tizca's glass pyramids and kill a brother legion in the name of obedience. Sisters of silence sharpened their null auras like drawn blades. Among the Terran contingent stood several sodalities of vault warders, custodians whose usual duty lay far below the palace's floors, now ordered to ride to war. They did not go to Prospero for honor. They went because Prospero was a library of nightmares waiting to be looted. When the censure host descended, they did so in carefully tiered waves. The first waves were killers, howling wolves and silent nulls and golden giants with spears in hand, tasked with breaking the back of the Thousand Suns. Sorcerers hurled witchfire across the plazas, rewriting reality in bleeding lines. The wolves answered with bolter and blade and the cold, suffocating presence of the Null Maidens. The Captain General led his custodians at the spear point, cutting down scarlet-armored psychers with a precision that made mockery of their desperate defenses. Behind that storm of blood and ruin came the wardens. They advanced through streets already, glazed with ash and fused glass, their dark armor drinking in the weeping light of burning towers. Vox orders directed them not towards barricades or sanctums of resistance, but towards the epicenters of knowledge. They converged on libraries where entire realities had been disassembled on parchment, on vaults where the Thousand Suns had bound entities and ideas in esoteric cages of their own, where a lesser conqueror might have put such places to the torch and called it justice. The Emperor had sent collectors. Amid the collapsing spires they harvested. Custodians tore open vault doors. Fevered psyker scribes had once genuflected before, their spears punching through runes of warning and welcome alike. Within, tomes bound in skin older than the Imperium, and in metals that strained the eye were seized, wrapped in sanctified chains and marked for transit. Artifacts that pulsed with slow, predatory rhythms were slammed into null coffins. Bound entities howled in voices you heard, with your bones, only to be cut short as ward fields closed over them, transforming once proud Prosperine experiments into entries on the Lockwarden's mental ledger. The burning of Prospero was a massacre and a tragedy, a brother legion cast down, a world flensed of its character. For the wardens, it was also a harvest. Prospero's ruin fed the dark cells. When the censure host withdrew and the last embers died under a rain of ashes, the vaults beneath the palace gained new occupants, each one another knot in the snarled thread that would link the Thousand Suns, the Wolves, and Terra forever. The great crusade staggered on, wounded by that act of fratricide, and then the War Master fell. The heresy erupted like a boil. Worlds that had sworn to the Emperor raised banners for Horus. Half the legions turned their guns inward. The Emperor himself went to war against his favored son. Everyone remembers, or thinks they remember, the siege of Terra from the walls. Above, the palace became a charnel house of titanic war. Traitor titans blasted apart bastions that had taken decades to raise. Loyalist engines died in reactors of sun-hot plasma. Space Marines clawed at one another across killing fields that had once been processional avenues. Battle barges burned in low orbit. The sky over the cradle of mankind was a bruise of smoke and void fire. Below, the siege of Terra was something else. In the dark cells, the Shadowkeepers walked their patrols under bombardment that rattled dust from the ceilings. Every impact shivered through the wards, sending ripples of stress along sigil lines and through hexagrammatic arrays. Every psychic scream from the surface echoed down into the bones of the prison. The warp seethed around Terra like an ocean in storm. The prisoners in the cells tasted that agitation through cracks too small to see. Some of the cells woke. Locks that had never moved since the age of strife creaked subtly under internal pressures. Sigils flared and dimmed in patterns that made no sense in normal geometries. There were moments when a Shadowkeeper would pause before a door and feel a presence on the other side, as keen and aware as his own, pressing back against the wards, testing them. Containment alarms whispered through the prison, not the crude blare of mortal warning systems, but deep, bone-felt notes keyed to the particular resonance of each cage. In some corridors, the air thickened with the scent of ozone and old cold blood, a sign that the boundaries between real space and the nightmares bound within it were straining. While titans died above, and the Emperor fought his traitor son in the heart of the palace, the wardens below fought their own war. They did it by standing still. They reinforced wards even as the world shook. They redirected power from non-critical systems to ward arrays, knowing that letting a corridor go dark was preferable to letting a single sigil fail. In places where the strain became too much, custodians gave their lives to enact last-ditch containment protocols. They died not to hold a wall against a World-Eater charge or to hold a gate against the Death Guard's rot, but to ensure that the walls between the dark cells and the rest of creation did not crack. When it was over, when Horus was dead and the Emperor broken upon his throne, when the fires on the walls gutted out and the surviving legions limped away to lick their wounds or plot their next treason, the palace was a ruin in all but name. In the halls below, the Shadowkeepers added fresh ghosts to their number, and the dark cells held. Then came the scouring. The loyalist forces drove the traitors from the heart of the Imperium, and hunted them into the edges of the galaxy. Chapters later, whole libraries would be filled with tales of those vengeful crusades, of worlds reclaimed, of demon worlds assailed, of fallen primarchs chased into exile. What those narratives rarely dwell upon is the detritus that war left behind. Every battlefield of the heresy and the scouring was littered not only with corpses and wreckage, but with the spiritual equivalent of toxic waste. Demon engines, crippled but not fully exorcised, lay half buried in ash plains. Warships captured from the traitor fleet still carried holds full of blasphemous shrines. Forge temples retaken from the Dark Mechanicum contained vats of half-finished abominations and data stacks full of prescribed knowledge. Relics once venerated by the traitor legions crawled with the psychic imprint of their master's fall. The very soil of certain worlds had been so saturated with warp energies and ritual bloodletting that to build upon it was to invite corruption. Into that aftermath went the custodians. The warden's task list expanded overnight. It was no longer enough to contain the horrors of Old Night and the occult experiments of the Great Crusade. Now they had to clean up after the heresy itself, to scour away not only traitor banners, but the metaphysical fallout of betrayal. Traitor artifacts were seized and sealed. Demon engines that could not be safely destroyed were taken apart and repurposed as prisoners, their screaming machine spirits bound into new cages. Corrupted Mechanicum experiments were transported piece by piece into cells where their influence could be smothered under layers of nullstone and auramite. In some cases, entire vaults from fallen forge worlds were cut free in slabs and ferried to Terra, still humming with forbidden power, to be slotted directly into prepared hollows under the palace. It was in the wake of that cataclysm that Robuta Guilliman, newly risen as Lord Commander and architect of the Imperium's survival, issued the edicts that would shape the next 10 millennia. The legions were broken into chapters to prevent any one commander from wielding such concentrated force again. The Imperium's institutions were codified, compartmentalized, bound in paper chains and doctrinal fetters. Among those reforms was a quiet decree concerning the Golden Warriors of the Emperor. The Legio Custodes was renamed the Adeptus Custodes, their status fixed within the new Imperial lexicon. More importantly for the wardens, their deployments were restricted. No longer would the 10,000 range freely across the stars as they had in the earliest days of conquest. Their place, officially, was Terra, the palace, the throne. The guardians of the Emperor would stand at his side, while others fought abroad. It was a gesture of trust and also of fear, an acknowledgement that such potent warriors, if ever turned, would be a threat no edict could counter, and that keeping them close to the crippled god they served was the safest compromise. For the Shadowkeepers, little changed. They had been palace-bound for decades already. Their war fought within rock and metal. Their enemies pressed against the inner surfaces of cell doors. Guilliman's edict simply codified a pattern of existence they were already living. While other custodians raged at their enforced withdrawal from the wider galaxy, feeling their war narrowed until it seemed to be fought in corridors and throne rooms alone, the wardens below continued as they always had, walking their routes, checking their seals, adding new prisoners to an ever-growing menagerie. The stain of the heresy, however, marked the dark cells forever. Where once the vaults under the palace had held mainly the leftovers of Old Night and the flotsam of the Great Crusade, now there were relics of treachery locked alongside them. Armor plates still scabbed with the colors of fallen legions, so soaked in warp and hatred that they wept rust and blood in equal measure. Tomes penned by sorcerers who had fought at Istvan and Terra, their words now frozen under stasis fields. Engines from the Dark Mechanicum that had drunk loyalist souls and demon ichor alike, now quiet, but never truly dormant. Each new arrival was another thread leading back to the war that had almost killed the species. Custodians who had once believed in the perfect inevitability of the Emperor's plan found their certainties eroded by what they handled. They had watched Primarchs fall, even if only through reports and prisoners' testimonies. They had walked past cells containing fragments of their works. Down in the dark cells, far from the rhetoric of rebuilding, it was difficult to maintain the old faith that humanity's destiny was a straight line drawn by an infallible hand. Bitterness crept into the cracks where devotion had lived. It did not sour into disloyalty. A custodian's loyalty is a weapon forged too carefully to shatter that easily. Instead, it became a grim, clear-eyed cynicism. They had seen what the Primarchs were capable of, for good and for ruin. They had watched the Imperial truth, that secular gospel of reason and unity, dissolve into Imperial cults and witch-burning fanaticism, even as they stood, guard over cells full of things that proved how right the Emperor had been to fear belief. In the Warden's eyes, the heresy had not merely scarred the Imperium, it had exposed it as something far more fragile and compromised than even they had suspected. After the scouring burned most of the traitors from the Imperium's core territories, the nature of the Shadowkeepers' war changed again. There were fewer open deployments. The days of marching through the burning streets of Prospero or boarding demon-plagued warships in the direct wake of battle became rare. Instead, the conflict turned inward and colder. Their enemies were not armies, but patterns. They monitored for the re-emergence of certain signatures in battle reports and Mechanicus data. A particular configuration of runes on a daemon engine sighted at the edge of Segmentum Solar. A fragment of code turning up in a hive's primary data stacks that matched scrap code quarantined since the days of the Dark Mechanicum. A cult prayer whispered in a forgotten corner of the Imperium, whose phrasing echoed liturgies once spoken in the halls of Horus's flagship. Each of these could be a sign that something from the cells had been copied, imitated, or perhaps even liberated. Servants of the Shadowkeepers quietly erased such outbreaks. Sometimes that meant dispatching a small force of custodians to a world to oversee a purge, their presence explained as a general check upon the loyalty of local commanders. Sometimes it meant sending instructions to the Inquisition, guiding their hand without revealing the source. Now and then, it meant opening a vault on Terra, unsealing a relic long kept only so that it could be used once in the right place, to counter or smother the echo of its own kind. The war was no longer a matter of lines on maps. It was a constant, invisible effort to prevent the nightmares of the heresy from taking root again. Other warriors moved on or died, or were reforged into something new. In the long centuries that followed, chapters rose and fell. Forge worlds turned their industries to ever more desperate war machines. Hive cities changed hands a dozen times over. The Shadowkeepers did not move. They did not forget. They lived in the wake of the greatest civil war the galaxy had ever seen, and they never left the site of their greatest fears. Instead of finding closure or renewal, they simply closed more doors, each new cell sealed, each new relic dragged into the dark, was another entry on an endless list of things that must never again see the light, a tally of traumas locked in place while the Imperium above staggered on, blind to the weight pressed into the bones of its throne world. In the long shadow that followed the heresy, the Imperium hardened into something sclerotic and cruel. Empires usually rot from the outside in. Terra was different. Terra calcified at the core first. For most of the 10 millennia that stretched from the end of that civil war to the closing years of the 41st millennium, the Adeptus Custodes were palace-bound.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Where once their forebears had strode the stars beside the Emperor, they now stood almost exclusively upon the stones of his cradle. Their world shrank to walls and wards and ceremony. For the Shadowkeepers, even that was generous. They rarely saw the sky of terror, and when they did, it was often only as a band of sick light glimpsed from a transit craft's ramp, or a narrow strip of stained atmosphere framed by a shaft vent. Theirs was a life lived almost entirely beneath the palace, in the tunnels and galleries and prison corridors that the rest of mankind had forgotten existed, if it had ever known. Generations of scribes were born, served, and died in the administratum without once reading the word that named them. Ecclesiarchs rose and fell, preaching from pulpits of skulls and gold, oblivious to the fact that beneath their sanctified feet lay a deeper sanctity, a darker guardianship that wanted no prayers. Silence has a way of shaping stone. It shaped the dark cells too. The prison complex did not remain static. The galaxy had not ceased to produce nightmares just because the heresy lay in the past. The Mechanicus still dug too deep into forgotten vaults and woke things better left to sleep. Rogue psychers still bloomed like cancers in the hives, their minds opening gateways in the air around them whenever their emotions surged. Xenos raiders and relic fleets still spat out artifacts that made even the most jaded magos take a step back. When such things could not be contained locally, when destruction threatened to unleash more than it resolved, terror became the last resort. New vaults were excavated beneath the already labyrinthine structure of the dark cells, cut into bedrock that had never known light. Old sections were reinforced, their original wards overlaid with newer patterns developed in the crucible of 10,000 years of war with the warp. Sigil arrays multiplied. Where once a single row of hexagrammatic seals had girded a cell's portal, now there were layers upon layers, each keyed to respond to a different flavor of metaphysical pressure. There were new wings carved specifically for rogue psychers, whose deaths would have triggered city-cracking detonations of empiric backlash. Their cells were lined with rare nullstone, the air within thick with the psychic deadness that only the most inert materials can produce. There were galleries of Xenos artifacts that defied Mechanicus analysis, objects that offended logic simply by existing, whose physical parameters changed slightly every time someone measured them. They sat behind transparent adamant barriers, surrounded by Auspex arrays that recorded every twitch and ripple, the data then sealed away like the artifacts themselves. The Shadowkeepers did not hold this line alone. The talons of the Emperor have always been more than the 10,000 themselves. Now and then, the silent, shaven-headed forms of null maidens moved through the depths, escorting particularly volatile prisoners or participating in warding rites. Their very presence made the air taste thin and brittle, their soulless auras flattening the psychic noise that clung to the old cells. In certain rituals, the custodians and the sisters stood together, gold and sable and black, their voices and their very states of being combined into patterns that reasserted dominance over the things locked beyond the doors. Other allies appeared more rarely still. There were Mechanicus savants, so altered by their work that it was hard to call them human, brought down under heavy guard to install or repair esoteric systems that only they understood. There were blind, faceless servitors whose flesh had been brain-burned of every trace of curiosity, set to mindless maintenance tasks in corridors where even a sliver of free will might have become a vector for corruption. The layers of safeguarding were not merely architectural, they were social, spiritual, psychological. If a danger found a way through one mesh of defenses, another lay ready behind it. Centuries turned over like pages in a book. The Shadowkeepers patrolled. They traced the same routes, nodded to the same sigils, listened to the same quiet hum of wards and sealed things. Time does not pass for a custodian as it does for a mortal. Their lives can span epochs. Their memories do not blur at the edges. Even so, the work took its toll. There is a difference between facing death in battle and living with the knowledge that a single misstep might put entire civilizations into the grave. The glory of battlefield heroics lies in its immediacy. You see the foe. You kill the foe. If you fail, you die with your brothers, and perhaps you even see, in your last moments, the catastrophe blooming from your defeat. In the dark cells, the horror is more suffocating, more adult. Every check of a lock is a small wager placed on the continuity of trillions of lives you will never see. Every sigh of metal under thermal stress raises the question, is this the sound of a universe about to come apart because I was not thorough enough, not cautious enough, not afraid enough? Shadowkeepers do not crumple under that pressure. They cannot, but they feel it. Over millennia, it eats at the edges of their motivations. Pride leaches away, replaced by something colder, a stripped-down, utilitarian sense of purpose. They are not there to be heroes. They are there because if they are not, no one else will be, and everything above them will eventually fall into the holes they guard. The war they fought was not entirely confined to the depths. The palace above was not immune to human frailty. There were palace coups, plots among the High Lords, assassinations planned by sycophants whose ambitions outgrew their caution. Official histories allude to the Adeptus Custodes intervening in such crises. They do not explain how those interventions were informed. The Shadowkeepers knew, better than anyone, what would happen if certain factions gained access to what lay under their boots. A would-be usurper whispered to by a demon might decide to trade the safety of the throne for the promise of power rooted in forbidden engines. A cabal of nobles might be foolish enough to think that unlocking one little vault was a defensible gamble, a way of redressing imagined slights. Whenever such possibilities arose, and they arose more often than the polite chronicles admit, the Shadowkeepers were part of the response. Custodians stepped out of hidden passages into private council chambers, their spears leveled, their eyes flat with a knowledge of worse things than treason. They strangled rebellions before they drew breath, not merely to protect the Emperor's mortal shell, but to prevent desperate men from reaching for solutions that should never be within their grasp. Some plots died on blades in the light of throne room braziers. Others ended in whispers and vanishing signatures, the conspirators' names blacked out in archives, their bodies never found. Above all this, faith grew like a tumor. In the wake of the heresy, the ecclesiarchy and the cult of the god emperor spread. Shrines multiplied. Cathedral spires stabbed at the sky of every hive and shrine world. The corpse upon the throne became, in the minds of the masses, a living divinity who listened to their prayers, judged their sins, and would one day raise them into some imagined light. Sermons thundered about his beneficence and his wrath. The same institutions that once had promulgated the imperial truth rewrote their doctrines to worship the very being whose message they had previously treated as godless. The wardens below had no such comforting myths. They saw the cables feeding into the throne. They smelled the chemical stench of the life support engines that kept the Emperor's physical form from collapsing into ash. They knew, from their witness of warp phenomena and the things in their cells, what really happened to most human souls when they died. Their faith, if it can be called that, was closer to grim obligation. They did not doubt the Emperor's greatness. They did not doubt that his continued half-life was all that kept the species from being drowned outright in the warp, but they did not tell themselves stories about joyous afterlives or divine mercy. Their litany was simpler. He must endure, and therefore we must endure for as long as it takes. In that context, training new Shadowkeepers was both necessity and cruelty. Every so often, a custodian among the 10,000 would be identified as a candidate for the depths. The criteria were not made public. They were felt, sensed, deduced by those already serving in the shield host. A certain lack of vanity, a particular steadiness in the face of metaphysical phenomena, a mind that asked few questions that did not have answers, and whose curiosity did not itch at the walls of forbidden knowledge. Those selected were subjected to tests of will and perception more brutal than any martial challenge. They were exposed to controlled fragments of the dark cell's influence, their reactions measured not by whether they flinched, but by whether they lingered, whether a part of them leaned toward the wrongness instead of away. Only when they had passed such trials were they brought down into the prison proper, not as visitors or reinforcements, but as initiates. Their oaths were sworn in the presence of the cells themselves. A Shadowkeeper stood before a row of doors that had not opened in recorded memory, and pledged his existence to keeping them closed. He was told, in plain terms, that his deeds would almost never be sung about. There would be no roll of honor for this shield host, no banners hung in the halls above recounting their campaigns. His victories would be invisible, his failures catastrophic. If he found that unacceptable, he was free to withdraw and return to other duties. Very few did. Those who stayed crossed an invisible line and never fully came back. Death came to them, not in the usual heroic forms. There were no glorious last stands under alien suns, no final charges captured in the stained glass of some distant chapel. Many fell in silent incidents. A warding ritual went wrong, and a custodian absorbed the psychic backlash before it could corrode the seals around him. A containment breach erupted like a localized apocalypse in a single corridor, and a squad died closing bulkheads and triggering null generators, their last sight a surge of impossible geometries snapping back into a cage. In the records of the Administratum, such events were often reduced to dry phrases: structural failure, maintenance incident, training accident. No mention of the thing that had reached through the cracks. Over the centuries, the Imperial Palace itself became something monstrous in its own right. It was always vast, always layered. But as time went on, and additions were bolted onto additions, it grew into a vertical world stacked upon itself. Shrines rose atop fortresses, their mosaics depicting saints who had died in wars fought to protect the same stones beneath. Bastions were built upon old cathedra, their gun emplacements overlooking plazas that once hosted pilgrim processions. Deep under all that, the prison sprawled, a negative echo of the splendor above. It became a mausoleum for history, a fortress against the future, and a cage for the present. The Shadowkeepers lived somewhere between those functions. They were buried, but not dead. They defended, but not in ways the public could see. They tended coffins, but those coffins sometimes blinked back at them. To walk their corridors was to move through layers of human folly and fear, each door a memorial to an age when someone, somewhere, had done something so terrible or so reckless that the only answer was to lock the consequence away forever. By the time the 41st millennium lurched toward its breaking point, the tension in those depths was almost a thing you could touch. 10,000 years of vigilance had coiled itself into every stone block and every ward line. The Shadowkeepers had been holding their breath for longer than most civilizations survive, waiting for the moment when all of their careful, invisible labor would prove either sufficient or vain. Above them, the Imperium staggered from crisis to crisis, oblivious to how thin the line had become. Below, the wardens listened to their doors, feeling with a warrior's instinct that soon, inevitably, something would go wrong loudly enough that their quiet war would be dragged into the open, whether the galaxy was ready for it or not. The wound in the sky did not arrive politely. It tore. Across the length of the Imperium, the great rift opened like a slit, cut through the fabric of reality, and the howling of the warp poured through. To the men and women huddled in hive warrens and aboard void ships, it was an apocalypse of screaming lights and dead machinery, of prayers unanswered and astropaths bursting like overripe fruit. On Terra, it was worse. The Astronomicon spasmed. Choirs of bound psychers died in rows as their minds were dragged out of their bodies and fed to something none of them had words for. The heavens above the palace bloomed with colors, no spectrum could chart. Sigils the size of continents burning briefly in the upper atmosphere before fading, leaving only a sense of having been watched. The shock did not stop at the crust. It plunged downward. The Imperial Palace is a mountain turned inside out, a maze of stone and adamantium and void shield generators that reaches as far below the surface as it does above. When the Great Rift clawed across the galaxy, the stress of that metaphysical violence ran down those structures like water. Wards that had slumbered for 10,000 years flared sickly there, lines of power boiling as the warp pressed in from every angle. Sigils etched into walls by the Emperor's own hand flickered. The dark cells, buried in the deepest strata, rang like a bell struck by an invisible hammer. Shadowkeepers on patrol felt the change as a pressure in their skulls, as a sudden tightening in the air. The hum of the wards rose, a keening edge laid over the usual background drone. In some corridors, the lumen strips dimmed to rust-colored glows, shadows trembling as if alive. At certain doors, the metal of the seals bulged slightly outward, pushed from within by forces that had never before managed to move them at all. For a while, it was chaos. Alarms that had never sounded in recorded memory whispered through the bones of the prison, low notes that bypassed audio and resonated directly in the nervous system. Null generators screamed as they spun up to full strength, fighting to thicken the walls between the cells and the storm beyond. Custodians moved in, pairs and squads, reinforcing key portals, diverting power, physically bracing gates that had begun to quiver. They did it all without comment, without panic, with the cold expertise of warriors who had waited 10,000 years for this moment and had always known, on some level, that it would come. Then, as suddenly as it had spiked, the pressure dipped. The storm did not end, but it moved on, finding a new equilibrium. Terror did not die. The throne still burned. The wards, to the naked eye, held. The accounting that followed is the sort of work that only the utterly patient and the utterly terrified can do properly. The Shadowkeepers fanned out through the dark cells. Every corridor was walked. Every door was examined. Auspex sweeps were run along every seam, not once but many times. The smallest crack in a sigil line, the slightest discrepancy in the resonance of a ward, could mean that something inside was not what it had been. Custodians whose memories stretched back to the heresy compared what they saw now with what they had known for centuries. Younger wardens cross-checked their observations with records engraved in mind and metal alike. They found bodies first. Here and there, in positions of perfect attention, custodians lay dead. Some had gone down mid-stride, their poses frozen in the act of turning toward a particular cell door. Others knelt before sigil arrays, hands outstretched as if reaching to reinforce a faltering pattern. In all of them, the cause of death was the same in essence, if not in detail. Hearts stopped by forces that had pounded at them from the inside. Brains cooked at the edges by the sheer violence of the warp pressing against their souls. There were no wounds on their armor. Their enemies had never touched them. They had simply died where they stood, at their posts, as the universe tore. Then they found the empty cells. The locks were still in place. The wards, when tested, still flared with the correct energies. The doors showed no sign of having been forced. Yet beyond those portals, there was nothing. No pressure, no presence, no signature of the occupants that had once made the air vibrate. Relics that had hummed with malign potentials for millennia were gone. Entities that had pressed like hands against glass were absent. In some cases, the only evidence that anything had ever been there was a faint, lingering echo in the immaterium, like the impression left in a mattress after the sleeper has risen. Whatever had held them had been bypassed, not broken. They had simply slipped away, following the path of least resistance out into a galaxy suddenly riddled with new cracks. The records do not say how the Lockwarden reacted when the full scope of the loss became clear. Borser Thursk was not given to theatrical displays. If he felt despair, he likely crushed it before it could reach the surface. What he did feel was responsibility. The emergency accounting began, in halls that doubled now as charnel houses for their own kind. The captains of the Shadowkeepers gathered around, slowly updating inventories. They summoned up mind sigils that represented each cell, each relic, each prisoner. They cross-referenced ancient annotations written by long-dead wardens with the impressions held in the Lockwarden's mind. They marked the empty cells in somber colors and traced the lines of potential consequence from each absence. A bioweapon bred in the pits of old night, designed to devour the psychic potential of entire populations and feed it to a single point. A shard of a Xenos divinity that had once ruled a whole spiral arm. A war spirit excised from its engine and bottled in a logic engine no larger than a man's torso, its code infectious even to glance. Each was now at large, somewhere in an Imperium already half swallowed by madness. The tally took time, but not as much as it should have. The Shadowkeepers are creatures of habit and precision. Their records were prepared for this, even if their souls were not. When the count was finally done, its implications were inscribed in silence on every auric plate in that lightless council. Containment had failed. Not everywhere, not fatally, but enough. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes had been bound by edict to terror. Their deployments beyond the throne world were rare, reluctant, and tightly constrained. With the birth of the Great Rift and the rise of Roboute Guilliman's Indomitus crusade, that restraint began to crack. The Golden Warriors stepped back onto the galactic stage, not just as symbols, but as swords and shields in their own right. They joined crusades, shattered demonic incursions, and reminded the enemies of mankind that the 10,000 still existed and that their patience had limits. For the Shadowkeepers, the change was more drastic. Their battlefield was no longer a corridor. Any world where a trace of warp-tainted code might resurface, any war-torn shrine where an echo of a bound entity might be heard in the chanting of a new cult, any forge where an engine moved in a way that suggested too much awareness became their concern. The Lockwarden's mental map of the dark cells broke open and expanded, its nodes now mirrored by points of light and infection across the star charts of a galaxy in flames. Borser Thursk made his vow and left Terra. He had spent a century and a half under the palace, during which he had stepped away from its stones only twice. Now he boarded a strike craft and did not look back. Shadowkeeper detachments went with him, squads of sable-armored custodians whose boots had worn grooves in the same few corridors, now striding down gun bays and drop holds, their cloaks snapping in the recycled air. They translated into warp routes that looked like knife wounds in reality. They emerged over worlds whose names meant nothing to them, beyond the coordinates listed next to the possibility that an escaped prisoner might be there. 2. Those on the receiving end of their interventions, they must have looked like the wrath of a forgotten god. A war raged on some front 1,000 light years from Terra. Guardsmen died in windrows before the guns of a heretic warlord who seemed uncannily resistant to death, his wounds closing, his glare burning with a too familiar inner light. Space Marines from a nearby chapter prepared to mount a desperate boarding action against his flagship. Then, out of the void, a custodian vessel arrived. Without explanation, it punched through the cordon of enemy escorts, drove straight for the flagship's flank, and disgorged Shadowkeepers into its arteries. They fought like executioners, working to a deadline. They carved a path not toward the bridge or the engine rooms, but toward a shrine deep in the ship's heart, a place where the warlord had shackled himself to a relic that pulsed with stolen power. Thursk himself stepped into the sanctum, his spear a line of golden inevitability, and, cut the man down not as an enemy commander, but as a tether to the thing behind him. The relic was sealed in nullstone, the corpse left cooling on the deck. The custodians withdrew without speech. Long after they vanished into the warp again, the soldiers who had fought and bled in that campaign still argued about what, exactly, had been the true target of that sudden, brutal assault. Scenes like that played out again and again. On demon-haunted rock worlds, where entire populations had been distilled into a single screaming node of warp energy, the Shadowkeepers descended, not to save the survivors, there were none by the time their boots hit the ground, but to capture and bottle the ritual's focal points. On Forge Moons, where Mechanicus Magi had rashly interfaced recovered engines with their own data looms, golden giants appeared in the middle of blooming scrap code infestations, severed the connections, and hauled the corrupted cores away in chains of light and null. For the wardens themselves, the transformation was a kind of whiplash. They had spent centuries measuring their days in the echo of their own footsteps and the slow cycles of ward maintenance. Now they were thrown into rapid deployments. 1 week they were fighting in the throat of a warp storm, the very air crawling with demonic parasites trying to find a way into their armor seams. The next, they were stalking through the quiet, clinical halls of a forge where every servo skull and every cogitator prompt could be a vector for encoded infection. They fought alongside chapters who barely understood what they were doing there. Some Astartes resented the implication that they could not handle their own wars. Others watched the Shadowkeepers work with grudging respect, recognizing in them a kind of focus even a gene-wrought super-soldier could appreciate. Regiments of the Astra Militarum cowered and tried not to stare as auric and sable forms walked through their lines, leaving a sense of wrong-footed awe in their wake. To the mortals on those battlefields, it was never entirely clear whether they were being saved, assessed, or condemned. The methods the Shadowkeepers used in these campaigns echoed the principles they had lived by in the depths. They did not simply kill, they captured. Enemies whose souls reeked of some older, deeper taint were not executed on the spot, but bound, shackled in auric chains inscribed with wards as dense as those on any cell door. War engines whose machine spirits snarled with recognizable flavors of heresy were not blown apart, but disabled with surgical strikes, their cores extracted like poisoned hearts. In the chaos of battle, squads of custodians could be seen performing actions that made no sense to anyone reading the conflict as a simple clash of armies sealing off specific loci, enacting rites over certain pieces of wreckage, marking constructs for later retrieval. Every such action was another link in an expanding prison network. The dark cells were no longer only under terror. Temporary holding vaults were established on key worlds, built according to patterns designed to allow later integration into the main complex. Some prisoners were processed there and then, smothered under layers of null until whatever made them unique was snuffed out. Others were transported all the way back to the cradle of mankind, escorted through storms that would have torn lesser ships apart, to take up places in the cages their escaped predecessors had left empty. Above all this, the Imperium was trying, clumsily, to reform itself. Robut Guilliman, resurrected from a tomb of stasis, looked upon a realm he had once helped build and found it bloated, superstitious, and fracturing. He raised new armies. He wrote new codices. He tried to drag the lumbering carcass of the Imperium into some shape that might survive the new era of constant howling warp storms. In that process, he had to deal with the Custodes as they now were, not merely as the honor guard he remembered. Guilliman was a Primarch, a being of immense intellect and iron will. He understood more about the Emperor's design than any living man, yet even he was kept at arm's length from certain truths. The work of the Shadowkeepers was one of them. He knew, in abstract, that Terra held prisons for things too dangerous to destroy. He knew that those prisons had been compromised by the Great Rift. He could see the evidence every time he signed off on a campaign plan that included a Shadowkeeper detachment heading into some particularly cursed corner of the galaxy. But the details, the inventory, the specific nature of the threats, the full scope of what had escaped those were withheld. It was not a slight, it was policy. Some knowledge was too corrosive even for a Primarch, not because he would abuse it, but because merely having it would change the decisions he made, pulling him away from the already impossible task of holding the Imperium together into the narrower, deeper focus of dealing with those buried horrors directly. The Lock Warden and his brothers bore that burden instead, leaving Guilliman to build his crusades on a foundation of necessary ignorance. To the ordinary citizen, the distinction did not matter. All they saw, if they saw anything at all, were terrible angels. A world might be on the edge of disaster, a plague of possessions spreading through its hab blocks, an outbreak of cult violence centered on a relic unearthed in some forgotten mine, a series of machine failures whose pattern made tech priests mutter in binaric panic. Then the sky would tear again, this time in a much smaller way, as a custodian ship forced a translation directly into high orbit. Golden and black dropships would fall through fire and ash. Men on the ground would look up and see silhouettes that belonged on cathedral vaults, now striding through their streets with weapons ready. Sometimes the arrival of the Shadowkeepers coincided with salvation. The outbreak was contained. The cult leaders were slain. Whatever relic lay at the heart of the mess was taken away. Sometimes the worlds they visited did not survive the process. When a threat was already too embedded, when the risk of leaving any trace of it outweighed the value of the population, the solution was more absolute. Virus bombs, cyclonic torpedoes, a firestorm from orbit under the supervision of a custodian who watched with flat eyes and recorded, somewhere in the back of his mind, that one more loose end had been cauterized. Then they were gone. No explanations, no sermons, no recruitment. Just an aftertaste of ozone and blood, and stories that would be told in drinking dens and over shrine altars for generations, each retelling moving further from the truth and closer to comforting myth. The law does not say how many cells remain unaccounted for. It leaves that number deliberately vague, an absence the mind cannot help but fill with its own worst imaginings. Nor does it say what new horrors have been born out in the wider galaxy, while the Shadowkeepers race from crisis to crisis, always just behind the curve of the unfolding apocalypse. Every war they fight in the era Indomitus is in some sense a battle against time. They are trying to plug gaps in a dam that was never meant to hold this much pressure, chasing escapees that have had years to vanish into the cracks of a broken civilization. The Great Rift remains. The galaxy is still wounded. Somewhere in that splintered dark, things that were once locked beneath the Imperial palace are learning how to exert their will again, stretching their influence through cults, machines, and wars. Behind them, relentless as the grinding of tectonic plates, the Shadowkeepers move, their numbers finite, their patience vast, their dread unspoken. The cells were opened. The only question that matters now is whether they can ever all be closed again, or whether the day will come when even their 10,000 years of vigilance will be revealed as nothing more than a delay before the inevitable. The Shadowkeepers are more than a shield host, and more than a line on some hidden roster. They are the Imperium's basement made flesh. They are what you get when an empire decides that the only way to survive is not to solve its worst problems, but to lock them away where no one has to look at them. The Imperium does not heal. It does not cleanse. It bricks its sins behind adamantium and sanctified hexagrammic wards, then tells itself that if the walls hold long enough, that is the same thing as victory. Every civilization has places it does not talk about. The Imperium of Man simply had the power to build those places into the bedrock of its own throne world. The dark cells are a confession written in stone. They say, without words, that there are things the master of mankind could not destroy and would not trust anyone else to even see. The Syriae, Shadowkeepers, pace those corridors as the custodians of that admission. Their entire existence is proof that the Imperium's story of constant righteous triumph is a lie told to children and martyrs. The real truth sits in cages, humming. No one understands that better than the Adeptus Custodes themselves, and among them, none feel the weight of it like the wardens in Sable. The common citizen believes that when he dies, his soul will flow upward into some imagined radiance, to be judged and embraced by the Emperor he has spent his life worshipping. The priests encourage this fantasy. The ecclesiarchy builds its entire purpose upon it. The truth, as the custodians have seen again and again in the warp-scoured places of the galaxy, is uglier. Most souls fade almost at once, scattering like ash in an empiric gale. Others are snatched by the predators that lurk just beyond the skin of reality, shackled into eternal torments, or smashed into slavering fragments to serve as fodder for horrors without number. There is no great, orderly procession to a golden heaven. There is hunger and dissolution and the occasional brutal utility of being fed to the Astronomicon, so that others might die a little later. The Shadowkeepers listen to the prayers piped down through the palace stone. They hear shrine choirs singing about the Emperor's mercy and his endless love. They know that the corpse on the throne is a burning engine of will, not a kindly father waiting with open arms. They know more intimately than most what waits in the warp for those who are not shielded by psycha discipline or nullstone. Yet they do not stride into basilicas to shout down the sermons. They maintain the lie because they have to. If the Imperium ever truly understood the universe it lives in, the work crews would lay down their tools, the soldiers would drop their lasguns, and the entire edifice would fold in on itself in a single, stunned moment of despair. Containment in that light is not a sign of confidence. It is an admission of failure. The very existence of the dark cells proves that the Emperor, in all his power, anticipated the limits of his own control. If he had believed that his rational, secular, imperial truth could sweep away all superstition and all warp-tainted horror, there would have been no need for a prison beneath the palace. The old night should have ended cleanly with his rise, its relics and abominations reduced to vapor under the weight of his wrath. Instead, there is a labyrinth of vaults under his throne, each one a monument to some moment when even he decided that destroying a thing was too dangerous, and that the only answer was to hide it forever. That is the secret spine of the setting. For all the talk of crusades and compliance, of primarchs and black crusades, for all the sagas of space marines leaping from stormbirds and guardsmen dying in lines, the final line of defense may be a handful of black-armored custodians walking a corridor, not on a distant battlefield, but on Terra, within arm's reach of doors that must never move. If one of those doors truly opens, if something within steps out unbound, there is no third act, no last stand in which a hero buys time for evacuees, no noble sacrifice on a fortress wall. The scale of what is held in those cages is such that, if it ever fully escapes, the story ends where it stands. That is why the horror of the Shadowkeepers is not theatrical. There are demons that burst from tear wounds with claws and fire and spectacle. There are demon worlds where the sky screams and the ground is made of faces. Those are loud horrors, fit for visions and myths. The dark cells are the opposite. Their terror lies in the grind, endless vigilance, unending risk calculations, a constant, suffocating awareness that you are maintaining a system that can never truly be repaired, only shored up, that every choice you make is a wager laid across the lives of uncounted trillions. It is a very adult kind of horror, devoid of glamour. No one paints mosaics of a Shadowkeeper checking a lock for the 1000th time. No chronicler writes epics about the tightening of a ward pattern or the recalibration of a null generator. Yet those acts decide more about the future of humanity than 100 heroic charges. The men who perform them understand with a clarity that would break a mortal mind that if the galaxy ever truly comprehends what they are doing, it will already be too late. Awareness in this context comes only in the moment of failure, like the realization that you have been breathing poison for years and only now feel it burning in your lungs. The legend of the Adeptus Custodes, for those who know even a fraction of the truth, is all gold and light. They are the Emperor's own, the 10,000, the auric giants whose armor refines the sun into metal. In stained glass and hollow fresco, they are shown striding through bombardment as if it were rain. Their spears blaze, their cloaks snap. They are the vengeance and protection of a god made manifest. The Shadowkeepers are the black underside of that legend. Their armor is darkened to blend with the shadows where no one is supposed to look. Their heraldry speaks in the language of keys and chains rather than laurel wreaths and purity seals. They spend centuries face to face with the things humanity wants, above all to pretend do not exist. When they deploy into the light, they do so draped in gloom, their crimson robes like sealing wax gone hard and dark with age. To see them is to be reminded that the Emperor's power is not only expressed in triumph and splendor, but also in the miserable necessity of keeping his mistakes and his enemies boxed up like diseased relics. Within those boxes lies a wealth of narrative possibility, even if the official chronicles will never catalogue it in detail. Somewhere out in the dark, one can imagine an ancient war mind waking up. It was born in old night, an artificial intellect that once commanded fleets that blackened whole constellations. It fell, was captured, was dissected by the Emperor's savants, and then locked away under terror. When the Great Rift tore reality, a fragment of that intellect slipped through, propagated itself into some half-corrupted data net on a frontier world. Now it grows again, teaching local machines old tricks under new names, its influence creeping along trade routes in the form of helpful scrap code that always seems to make things run just a little more efficiently until it does not. Elsewhere, a weapon god might be walking under another sky. Perhaps it is a macro weapon whose spirit was bound in the cells for trying to eat its own crew. Perhaps it is an alien artifact that drank suns on command. Now it sits at the heart of a heretical forge, reshaped by the hands of adepts who have no idea what kind of soul they have hammered into place. It begins again, dressed in fresh sigils, its old hunger wearing a new name. On yet another world, a cult gathers around an object dug up from beneath a collapsed manufactorum, an object that murmurs to them in dreams with a voice that has been silent since the siege of Terra. They think they are worshipping a new saint. They are wrong. Far away, Borser Thursk or his successor feels a familiar pressure in the warp, an itch that matches an absence on the ledger and turns a strike vessel toward that nameless system. All of that is speculation, but it is speculation rooted in the logic of the setting. The dark cells are not just storing bodies and machines. They are storing ideas, ways of thinking, entire sciences and philosophies that have been declared too dangerous to be allowed in the wild. The Adeptus Custodes, through the Shadowkeepers, are not merely the Emperor's bodyguards. They are jailers of concepts. Every time they drag a device into a cell, instead of letting it scatter its blueprints across the data nets, they are amputating a branch of technological possibility. Every time they incarcerate a heretic who has genuinely discovered something new, even if that discovery is wrapped around a demon's jaw, they are pruning the tree of human thought. They know that allowing certain lines of research to exist will, almost inevitably, lead back to old night. So they cage the research and the researcher alike. The Imperium above sees this as necessary when it bothers to see it at all. What it does not admit is that this has locked the species into a permanent, chosen stagnation. Progress is permitted only in narrow, heavily monitored channels. Everything else goes into the basement. In that sense, the Shadowkeepers are a living parallel to the older stories of the era of ruin and the scouring, the tales that focus not on victory, but on the people left picking through the wreckage. After the Siege of Terra, there were warriors and civilians alike who had to live among the ruins of their own certainties. They had seen the Emperor wounded, the Primarchs fallible, the legions split. Their work was not glorious. It was rebuilding, burying, survivors' labor. The Shadowkeepers are that ethos turned into an institution. Their duty is not to usher in a golden age, it is to manage fallout, to triage the consequences of the past and make sure they do not entirely devour the present. The final cruelty and their final success is that they are most effective when no one knows they exist. If the average citizen of the Imperium has never heard the word Shadowkeeper, that means the locks have held, the cells have stayed closed, and the nightmares have remained, for the most part, hypothetical. The day their name becomes common knowledge, the day people on dozens of worlds start using it as a curse or a prayer, will be the day those people are watching them fail in real time. If the Shadowkeepers ever falter loudly enough that the whole galaxy can see what they have been guarding, it will mean that the doors have opened and will not close again. There will be battles and crusades and hastily minted saints, songs shouted over the roar of collapsing heavens, but none of it will matter. You cannot put ignorance back in its cage once it has seen what was in the basement. You cannot unbreak the walls between reality and the things the Emperor feared most. Until that day, the wardens walk their corridors, black and crimson in the half-light, listening to doors that never move and praying in their own hard, wordless way, that they never have to show the rest of mankind what they have been keeping in the dark.